The microphone slides across the banquet table as my nephew reaches for it, his wedding ring catching the chandelier light. I had built Whitmore Construction from nothing. 42 years of dawn starts and concrete dust. 42 years of missing Christmas mornings to finish emergency repairs. The company logo still bore my initials, though most people had forgotten what the W stood for. My brother Daniel had joined me in the early days, back when we shared coffee from the same thermos and split gas money for the work truck. We were partners then, equals in sweat and ambition. But somewhere along the way, partnership became hierarchy. Daniel's son Marcus had grown up in the office, learning the business from carpeted floors instead of muddy job sites. He wore pressed shirts where I wore tool belts. He spoke to clients about margins, while I spoke to crews about craftsmanship. The transition felt natural at first, youth bringing energy to experience, fresh ideas complementing old wisdom. But natural transitions can become hostile takeovers when nobody is watching the fine print. My nephew had made it clear that my time was ending. Not through formal meetings or documented discussions, but through the small erosions that reshape landscapes. My parking spot had been reassigned to visiting clients. My name had been removed from the monthly newsletter. The holiday bonus checks now bore his signature instead of mine. Daniel supported his son as fathers do, but his support felt more like relief than conviction. He was ready to retire, ready to let Marcus carry the weight he had grown tired of bearing. I understood his weariness even if I couldn't share it. Work had never been a burden for me to shed. It had been my identity, my purpose, my proof of worth in a world that measured men by their contributions. The evening had started like any other company banquet, annual celebration of completed projects and profitable quarters, wives in cocktail dresses, employees in their best suits, and the familiar mixture of achievement and alcohol that marked our December gatherings. I had taken my usual seat at the back table, the one reserved for retirees and distant relatives. The view was adequate, the conversation polite, and the isolation complete. Marcus had been holding court at the head table all evening, 28 years old, and already commanding the room like he had built the company with his own hands. His presentation covered the year's successes with practiced confidence, new contracts, expanded territories, and increased profits. The numbers were impressive, though they built on foundations I had spent decades pouring. He spoke about innovation and modernization, about bringing the company into the 21st century. Each word felt like a small burial, another shovel of dirt on the relevance I had once claimed. The applause came in waves, enthusiastic and genuine. These people respected him, trusted him, saw him as their future. I couldn't fault their judgment, even as it stung. Marcus was capable, ambitious, and unburdened by the stubborn traditions that had defined my approach to business. He would probably take Whitmore Construction farther than I ever could have imagined. The recognition should have filled me with pride, but pride requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement requires visibility. From my back table, I was a shadow of former significance, present but not participating, honored but not essential. The evening wore on with the predictable rhythm of corporate celebrations, awards for safety records, recognition for long-term employees, and the annual scholarship announcement for children of company workers. I had established that scholarship 15 years earlier, though my name had been quietly removed from the presentation materials. Progress, Marcus had explained, required focus on the future rather than the past. The logic was sound, even if the execution felt like erasure. I watched the faces around me, familiar people who had once sought my approval and guidance. They were engaged, entertained, and completely comfortable with the new order of things. Change had come gradually enough that most hadn't noticed the shift in power. Or perhaps they had noticed and simply adapted, as smart people do when survival requires flexibility. Either way, my presence had become ceremonial, a courtesy extended to the company founder, but not a necessity for the company's future. The presentation had moved into its final phase when Marcus called for attention once more. He wanted to address the future of Whitmore Construction, he said, and the leadership structure that would guide them through the coming decade. His voice carried the authority of someone who had never doubted his right to speak for others. The room quieted with the expectation of significant announcements. I could feel the energy shift as people leaned forward in their chairs, anticipating news that might affect their careers and livelihoods. This was the moment when speculation would become reality, when whispered conversations would transform into official policy. Marcus began with gratitude, thanking the team for their dedication and hard work. He acknowledged the company's history, its reputation, and its commitment to excellence. The words were appropriate, professionally crafted, and completely devoid of specific recognition for the man who had created the foundation he now stood upon. I listened with the detached interest of someone hearing a story about strangers. He spoke about streamlining operations and eliminating redundancies, about focusing resources on core competencies and strategic growth initiatives. The language was familiar from business magazines and consultant reports, the kind of terminology that transformed human decisions into corporate imperatives. Behind the euphemisms lay a simple truth that everyone in the room could decode. Old ways were being replaced by new methods, past leadership was being superseded by fresh vision, and certain individuals were being transitioned into roles more suited to their current capacities. My nephew's eyes found mine across the room as he delivered this message. The look was not malicious, but it was final. He had made his decision about my future, and this gathering was his opportunity to make that decision public. The audience waited for specifics, for names and dates and concrete details. Marcus smiled as he prepared to provide them. The microphone carried his words clearly to every corner of the banquet hall, ensuring that his message would reach every person who needed to hear it, including the one person who needed to hear it most. He began by explaining that effective leadership required difficult decisions. That progress sometimes demanded changes that might seem harsh, but were ultimately necessary for the greater good. His tone was reasonable, almost apologetic, as if the decisions he was announcing had been forced upon him by circumstances beyond his control. The room remained silent, sensing the weight of what was coming. Marcus talked about my contributions to the company, my years of service, and my role in building what had become a regional success story. The past tense was unmistakable, even wrapped in diplomatic language. He spoke about my dedication, my work ethic, and my commitment to quality. All admirable qualities, he suggested, but qualities that belonged to an earlier era of the construction industry. Modern projects required different skills, different approaches, different leadership styles. The implication was clear without being explicitly stated. I had become a relic, useful for historical perspective, but unsuited for contemporary challenges. The audience listened with uncomfortable attention, recognizing the subtext, but uncertain how to respond. Some faces showed sympathy, others relief, and a few displayed the careful neutrality of people protecting their own positions. Marcus continued with his announcement, outlining the new organizational structure that would take effect after the first of the year. Department heads would report directly to him. Major decisions would be centralized under his authority, and certain advisory roles would be eliminated to improve efficiency and clarity of command. He never mentioned my name during this part of his speech, but everyone understood which advisory roles were being eliminated. My title of senior consultant would disappear along with my office, my parking space, and my regular presence at company meetings. The transition would be handled professionally, with appropriate recognition for my past service and adequate compensation for my cooperation. But cooperation was not really optional, and recognition would not extend beyond this evening's acknowledgement. Marcus closed his remarks by looking directly at my table, his expression a mixture of respect and finality. He thanked me publicly for everything I had given to Whitmore Construction, and he wished me well in whatever pursuits might occupy my retirement years. The applause that followed was polite but brief, the kind of recognition given to someone already gone. My brother Daniel had avoided eye contact throughout Marcus's speech. He studied his wine glass, adjusted his tie, and found reasons to look anywhere except toward my table. 40 years of partnership, and he couldn't meet my gaze when his son dismantled everything we had built together. I understood his position, even sympathized with it. Choosing between your business partner and your child is no choice at all. But understanding didn't soften the sting of abandonment, and sympathy didn't ease the isolation of being erased by people who had once depended on your guidance. The evening continued around me as if nothing significant had happened. Conversations resumed, drinks were refilled, and the normal social rhythms of a company party reasserted themselves. A few colleagues approached my table with awkward condolences, offering handshakes and expressions of regret about my departure. Their kindness was genuine but brief, the interaction of people saying goodbye to someone they wouldn't see again. Most kept their distance, uncertain how to navigate the social complexity of my situation. I was simultaneously the guest of honor and the evening's casualty, deserving both respect and avoidance. The contradiction was too complex for casual conversation, so casual conversation simply flowed around me like water around a stone. I remained at my table as the crowd began to thin, watching people I had known for decades collect their coats and head for the parking lot. They spoke about the presentation, about Marcus's vision, about the changes coming to the company. Their tone was optimistic, forward-looking, and completely divorced from any concern about the person being left behind. Change was exciting when you were part of it, when your position was secure and your future was bright. Change was devastating when it meant displacement, when it signified the end of relevance and the beginning of invisibility. I finished my coffee and considered the drive home to an empty house, to rooms that would echo with silence and memories of a life that had revolved around work that no longer needed me. The parking lot was nearly empty by the time I reached my truck. December air cut through my suit jacket, sharp and clean after the warmth of the banquet hall. My hands shook slightly as I fumbled for the keys, though whether from cold or emotion was impossible to determine. The truck started reluctantly, the engine protesting the chill, but eventually settled into the familiar rhythm that had carried me to job sites for more years than I cared to count. I sat in the cab for several minutes, letting the heater warm the space while I processed what had just occurred. Marcus had handled the situation professionally, I had to admit. No public humiliation, no dramatic confrontation, no unnecessary cruelty. Just a clean, efficient removal of an obstacle to progress. I could respect the execution, even as I resented the outcome. The drive home took me past several projects I had overseen during my tenure with the company. A strip mall we had built during the recession, when work was scarce and every job felt like salvation. An office complex that had challenged every skill I possessed, pushing me to learn new techniques and master unfamiliar materials. A residential development where I had spent 3 months solving drainage problems that had stumped 2 other contractors. Each building represented months of my life, pieces of my identity cast in concrete and steel. They would outlast me by decades, anonymous monuments to skills that were no longer valued by the company that had once depended on them. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was driving past my own legacy while being forced into retirement by people who had inherited rather than earned their positions. My house appeared exactly as I had left it that morning, dark and quiet at the end of a street lined with similar structures. The similarity was comforting in its predictability, even as it emphasized the solitude that would now define my days. I had bought the place 15 years earlier, after my divorce, choosing it for its proximity to work rather than any particular charm or character. It had served as a functional base of operations, a place to sleep and store belongings between projects. Now it would become my entire world, 4 walls and a mortgage that would stretch my retirement savings thinner than I had planned. The kitchen light revealed mail scattered across the counter, bills and advertisements that had seemed manageable when I had a steady income, but now carried the weight of uncertain finances. Marcus had grown bolder in the days following the banquet. His confidence seemed to expand with each passing hour, as if my absence from the office had removed some invisible restraint on his authority. He instituted new policies with casual efficiency, restructuring departments and reassigning responsibilities without consulting the experience that had previously guided such decisions. The speed of change was breathtaking and deliberate. Within a week, my former office had been converted into a conference room. My desk had been donated to charity, my files had been digitized and archived, and my nameplate had been removed from the company directory. The erasure was so complete that visiting clients might never know I had existed at all. Daniel had called once to check on my adjustment to retirement, but the conversation was stilted and brief. We both understood that our relationship had been damaged by recent events, perhaps beyond repair. He was caught between loyalty to his son and guilt over abandoning his partner, while I was caught between anger at his betrayal and sympathy for his impossible position. Neither of us possessed the emotional vocabulary to bridge that gap, so we settled for polite distance instead of honest confrontation. My days began to follow a pattern of enforced leisure that felt more like punishment than reward. Morning coffee stretched into afternoon television, interrupted by grocery runs and household maintenance that consumed far more time than it deserved. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of neighbors leaving for jobs I no longer had and returning from responsibilities I no longer shared. Retirement was supposed to be a reward for decades of hard work, but it felt more like exile from the world that had once defined my worth. I found myself driving past construction sites, watching crews tackle projects that would have once fallen under my supervision. The work continued without me, competently and efficiently, as if I had never been essential to its completion. The realization was both humbling and liberating, humbling because it proved my dispensability, but liberating because it freed me from the illusion that I was irreplaceable. The world would continue turning, buildings would continue rising, and Whitmore Construction would continue growing under leadership that didn't include me. I had been cleaning out my garage when the letter arrived. 27 years of accumulated tools and equipment, relics of projects completed and skills mastered, now destined for estate sales and charity donations. The letter bore the return address of Morrison & Associates, attorneys I recognized from previous dealings with commercial contracts and liability issues. Their correspondence usually concerned routine legal matters, insurance updates and regulatory compliance, nothing that required immediate attention or personal response. But this letter was addressed to me personally, marked confidential, and thick enough to suggest multiple pages of detailed information. I opened it with mild curiosity rather than concern, expecting documents related to my departure from the company or perhaps pension matters that required my signature. The contents were far more interesting than routine paperwork. Morrison & Associates were writing to inform me about a situation involving Whitmore Construction that might require my immediate attention. They had been approached by a former client, Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne, regarding defective work performed on her residential project 3 years earlier. The project had been supervised by Marcus during his transition into greater responsibility, though it had been completed under the Whitmore Construction banner during my tenure as senior partner. Mrs. Hawthorne was claiming significant structural damage had developed in her home, damage she attributed to faulty foundation work and inadequate materials. Her engineering report suggested the problems were extensive and expensive, potentially requiring complete reconstruction of the affected areas. The legal implications were complex, the financial exposure was substantial, and the timing was particularly unfortunate for a company trying to establish its reputation under new leadership. I remembered the Hawthorne project clearly, though I had not been directly involved in its execution. Marcus had requested full autonomy over the job, presenting it as an opportunity to demonstrate his readiness for greater responsibility. I had agreed reluctantly, maintaining oversight, but allowing him to make the primary decisions about materials, methods, and scheduling. The project had been completed on time and within budget, apparently successfully, though I had noticed some irregularities in the final documentation. Nothing that seemed critical at the time, but enough to make me ask questions that Marcus had deflected, with confident explanations and assurances of quality control. The engineering report attached to the lawyer's letter told a different story. Mrs. Hawthorne's foundation was settling unevenly, causing cracks in load-bearing walls and structural instability throughout the ground floor. The concrete mix had been substandard, the rebar placement was inadequate, and the drainage systems had failed completely. Water damage was spreading through the basement, threatening electrical systems and creating conditions for mold growth that could make the house uninhabitable. The total cost of repairs was estimated at over $200,000, far exceeding the profit margin on the original construction contract. Worse still, the defects appeared to be the result of cost-cutting measures, rather than honest mistakes or unforeseeable circumstances. Materials had been substituted without client approval, inspections had been scheduled inadequately, and critical work had been completed by inexperienced crews without proper supervision. The pattern suggested deliberate corner-cutting designed to maximize profits at the expense of structural integrity. Mrs. Hawthorne's attorney was preparing a lawsuit that would name Whitmore Construction as the primary defendant, with potential criminal charges if evidence of intentional fraud could be established. The case would likely attract media attention, given the severity of the defects and the reputation of the company involved. Insurance coverage might not apply if the problems stemmed from intentional misconduct rather than professional negligence. And Marcus, as the supervising contractor, would face personal liability that could extend far beyond his corporate protections. I set the letter down and considered its implications carefully. This was the kind of crisis that could destroy a construction company's reputation and financial stability. Clients would lose confidence, bonding companies would increase rates, and future projects would become increasingly difficult to secure. The timing was particularly devastating for Marcus, coming just as he was establishing his authority and implementing his vision for the company's future. A major lawsuit would undermine everything he had worked to achieve, possibly forcing him to return control to more experienced hands or accept outside management to satisfy insurance requirements and legal obligations. The irony was rich with possibility, though I felt no immediate satisfaction in my nephew's misfortune. Mostly I felt curious about how he would handle a crisis that threatened everything he had recently claimed. The phone calls started 2 days later. First Daniel, his voice strained with worry that he tried unsuccessfully to hide behind casual conversation. He asked about my health, my adjustment to retirement, and my plans for the holidays before eventually approaching the subject that had prompted his call. Had I heard anything about problems with the Hawthorne project, he wondered. Any communications from lawyers or insurance companies that might suggest developing issues? His questions were careful and indirect, probing for information without revealing how much he already knew about the situation. I confirmed that I had received the letter from Morrison & Associates and asked if he needed any assistance with the matter. The offer seemed to catch him off guard, as if he had expected defensiveness or demands for vindication rather than professional cooperation. We talked for another few minutes about technical aspects of the original construction, details that might be relevant to determining liability and developing a defense strategy. My memory of the project was clearer than his, my documentation more complete, and my understanding of Marcus's decisions more comprehensive, all of which made me valuable to their defense despite my recent banishment from company operations. Marcus called later that evening, his confidence noticeably diminished from the arrogance he had displayed at the banquet. He explained the legal situation in greater detail, outlining the challenges they faced in responding to Mrs. Hawthorne's claims. The engineering report was damaging, he admitted, but he believed it was exaggerated and that a competent defense could minimize their exposure. He needed my help, specifically my recollections of the project approval process and my copies of the original specifications and change orders. The documents were crucial to establishing that proper procedures had been followed and that any defects resulted from circumstances beyond their reasonable control. His request was polite but urgent, the tone of someone who had suddenly discovered the value of expertise he had recently discarded. I listened without commitment, asking questions about their current legal strategy and the timeline for responding to the lawsuit. Marcus answered with less confidence than usual, acknowledging gaps in their preparation that reflected his inexperience with major litigation. The case was more complex than anything he had handled previously, and the stakes were higher than any challenge he had faced in his brief tenure as company leader. The irony of my position was not lost on either of us. 3 weeks earlier, I had been dismissed as obsolete, a relic whose continued presence hindered progress and modernization. Now I was being courted as essential, the only person with sufficient knowledge to protect the company from catastrophic legal exposure. Marcus needed my expertise, my documentation, and my testimony to mount an effective defense against Mrs. Hawthorne's claims. But he also needed my cooperation, which was no longer guaranteed by family loyalty or professional obligation. I was free to choose my level of involvement, free to set conditions for my assistance, and free to demand compensation that reflected my actual value rather than my presumed dispensability. The reversal was complete and satisfying in ways I had not anticipated. Marcus tried to frame his request as a family obligation, suggesting that my help was necessary to protect Daniel's retirement security and preserve the company legacy we had all worked to build. The argument might have been persuasive a month earlier, when I still considered myself part of the Whitmore construction family, but dismissal had clarified my actual relationship to the company and its leadership. I was a former employee whose knowledge had suddenly become valuable, not a family member whose loyalty could be assumed without reciprocation. The distinction was important both legally and emotionally, establishing boundaries that would govern any future interaction between us. I told Marcus I would consider his request and provide an answer within a few days. The delay was partly practical, giving me time to review my files and assess the strength of his legal position, but it was also strategic, allowing him to fully appreciate the precariousness of his situation and the extent of his dependence on cooperation he could no longer take for granted. Power had shifted between us in ways that went beyond legal technicalities or business relationships. For the first time since his promotion, Marcus needed something from me that he could not simply take or demand. The experience was educational for both of us, though I suspected I was learning lessons that would prove more durable than his. Mrs. Hawthorne's lawsuit was filed on a Tuesday morning, generating exactly the media attention her attorney had promised. The local business journal ran a front-page story about construction defects and shoddy workmanship, complete with photographs of cracked walls and water damage that made Whitmore Construction appear criminally negligent. The article mentioned Marcus by name as the supervising contractor, noting his recent promotion to company leadership and his family connection to the founder. The timing could not have been worse for someone trying to establish credibility in a competitive industry. Other media outlets picked up the story throughout the week, each adding details that made the situation appear more serious and the company's response more inadequate. Television news included footage of Mrs. Hawthorne's damaged home, showing structural problems that looked devastating even to untrained viewers. Radio talk shows discussed the case as an example of corporate irresponsibility and declining professional standards. Social media amplified every negative detail, creating a perception of scandal that would be difficult to overcome, even with a successful legal defense. Marcus called me daily during this period, his desperation becoming more apparent with each conversation. The negative publicity was affecting other projects as potential clients questioned the company's competence and reliability. 2 pending contracts had been cancelled and 3 more were being reconsidered pending resolution of the lawsuit. Insurance premiums were increasing, bonding capacity was decreasing, and the company's credit rating was under review by multiple agencies. The financial pressure was mounting faster than he had anticipated, threatening the stability of operations that had seemed secure just weeks earlier. He offered increasingly generous terms for my assistance, beginning with consulting fees and progressing to equity participation in the company's recovery. The offers reflected both his growing panic and his belated recognition of my value to any successful defense strategy. But they also reflected his fundamental misunderstanding of my position and motivation. Money alone could not repair the damage done by his casual dismissal of my contributions, nor could financial incentives restore the respect that had been withdrawn so publicly and completely. My cooperation would require acknowledgement that went beyond temporary convenience, recognition that extended beyond immediate necessity. I spent those days reviewing my documentation of the Hawthorne project, analyzing the decisions that had led to the current crisis. The files told a clear story of cost-cutting and corner-cutting that had prioritized immediate profits over long-term quality. Marcus had substituted cheaper materials without proper testing, reduced inspection schedules to save time, and assigned inexperienced crews to critical work that required seasoned professionals. Each decision had been defensible individually, but collectively they represented a pattern of negligence that would be difficult to explain in court. More importantly, I found evidence that I had raised concerns about several of these decisions during the project, concerns that Marcus had overruled with assertions of his authority and expertise. My written objections were documented in emails and project reports, creating a record that would distinguish my judgment from his mistakes. The discovery was both vindicating and useful, providing leverage that could protect my reputation while exposing his incompetence. I also researched Mrs. Hawthorne's background and discovered interesting details about her property and financial situation. She was the widow of a successful businessman, wealthy enough to pursue litigation without concern for legal expenses. Her house was located in an exclusive neighborhood where construction defects would be particularly visible and embarrassing, and her attorney was known for aggressive tactics and substantial settlements in professional negligence cases. Marcus was facing an opponent with both the resources and motivation to pursue this case aggressively, regardless of his ability to mount an effective defense. The combination was formidable and potentially devastating for someone with limited experience in major litigation. On Friday afternoon, I called Marcus and asked him to meet me at my house that evening. The conversation we needed to have required privacy and time that office settings could not provide. He agreed immediately, grateful for any opportunity to discuss the situation and secure my cooperation. His eagerness was evidence of how completely his confidence had eroded since the lawsuit had been filed. The man who had dismissed me 3 weeks earlier was now pleading for assistance from the expertise he had declared obsolete. Marcus arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, dressed in the same expensive suit he had worn to announce my retirement, but carrying himself with none of the authority he had displayed that evening. The transformation was remarkable and revealing, showing how quickly circumstances could strip away artificial confidence and expose underlying insecurity. He accepted my offer of coffee and sat across from me at the kitchen table where I had spread the relevant project files. The documents represented thousands of hours of work and decades of accumulated knowledge, resources that had suddenly become crucial to his survival as company leader. He reviewed the files carefully, asking questions about specific decisions and requesting clarification about technical details that would be important to their defense strategy. His questions were intelligent and focused, demonstrating the competence that had originally justified his promotion, even as they revealed the gaps in experience that had led to the current crisis. I answered each inquiry completely and professionally, providing information that would help him understand both the strengths and weaknesses of his legal position. The conversation lasted nearly 3 hours, covering every aspect of the Hawthorne project from initial planning through final inspection. By the end, Marcus had a clear picture of the challenges he faced and the resources available for addressing them. He also had a clearer understanding of my role in the project and the value of my documentation to any successful defense. The evening had been educational for both of us, though in different ways. Marcus had learned the extent of his dependence on knowledge he had casually discarded, while I had learned the satisfaction of being needed by someone who had declared me unnecessary. We concluded with his formal request for my assistance as an expert witness and consultant in defending against Mrs. Hawthorne's claims. He offered compensation that was generous by any reasonable standard, though inadequate for the humiliation he had caused and the leverage he now needed. I told him I would provide my answer by Monday morning, giving both of us the weekend to consider the implications of whatever arrangement we might reach. As he prepared to leave, Marcus made one final appeal based on family loyalty and company legacy. The argument was familiar from our previous conversations, but it felt different now that he was asking, rather than assuming my cooperation. Monday morning brought clarity that the weekend's reflection had crystallized into decision. I called Marcus and agreed to assist with the Hawthorne defense, but with conditions that reflected my actual value rather than his perception of family obligation. My consulting fee would be substantial, my role would be clearly defined, and my expertise would be acknowledged publicly as essential to the company's survival. More importantly, I would require a formal statement acknowledging that my dismissal had been premature and that my continued involvement was necessary for Whitmore Construction's future success. The terms were non-negotiable, presented as requirements rather than requests. Marcus could accept them completely or find alternative assistance for problems that were entirely of his own making. He agreed immediately, desperate enough to accept conditions that would have seemed outrageous a month earlier, but now appeared reasonable given his circumstances. The reversal was complete and documented, creating a new relationship based on mutual benefit rather than assumed loyalty or inherited authority. Over the following weeks, I worked closely with the legal team to prepare our defense against Mrs. Hawthorne's claims. My documentation proved crucial in establishing that proper procedures had been attempted, even if they had been inadequately implemented by inexperienced personnel. My testimony would distinguish between design intent and execution failure, protecting the company's reputation while acknowledging specific mistakes that could be corrected through settlement negotiations. The strategy was complex but sound, offering a path through the crisis that could preserve both financial stability and professional credibility. Marcus participated in these preparations with newfound respect for expertise and experience, asking questions rather than making assumptions and accepting guidance rather than asserting authority. The change in his approach was remarkable and permanent, establishing a working relationship that acknowledged respective strengths rather than presumed hierarchies. He was learning lessons about leadership that business school had not taught and experience had not yet provided, lessons that would serve him well if he survived the current crisis. By month's end, it was clear that our defense strategy was working. Mrs. Hawthorne's attorney was showing interest in settlement discussions, and the media attention was shifting to other scandals and controversies. The company's reputation was recovering, contracts were being renewed, and financial stability was returning to levels that supported normal operations. The settlement negotiations took place in a downtown law office, neutral territory that emphasized the seriousness of the proceedings while avoiding any appearance of favoritism toward either party. Mrs. Hawthorne attended with her attorney, a sharp woman in her 50s, who had built her reputation on exactly this type of professional negligence case. Marcus represented the company along with their corporate counsel, while I participated as the technical expert, whose testimony would be crucial if the case proceeded to trial. The atmosphere was professional but tense, with everyone understanding that the outcome would determine not only financial consequences, but also the future viability of Whitmore Construction as a regional contractor. Mrs. Hawthorne's demands were substantial, but not unreasonable given the extent of damage to her property. She wanted complete reconstruction of the affected areas, compensation for temporary housing during repairs, and additional payment for the inconvenience and distress caused by the situation. The total amount approached $300,000, which was significant but manageable for a company with adequate insurance coverage and strong cash flow. More importantly, the settlement would include a confidentiality agreement that would prevent further media coverage and protect the company's reputation from additional damage. The negotiations continued for most of the day, with each side making concessions that gradually narrowed the gap between initial positions and acceptable compromise. My role was primarily technical, explaining the engineering issues and repair requirements that justified specific elements of the settlement amount. But I also served as a character witness for the company, providing credibility that Marcus's inexperience could not yet command in such serious circumstances. By late afternoon, we had reached an agreement that satisfied everyone's primary concerns while avoiding the uncertainty and expense of prolonged litigation. Marcus signed the settlement documents with obvious relief, understanding that his leadership of the company would continue without the cloud of legal scandal that had threatened its future. The crisis was over, but its lessons would influence his approach to business for years to come. He had learned the value of experienced guidance and the cost of overconfident independence. Most importantly, he had learned that respect could not be demanded or inherited, but had to be earned through competence and maintained through humility. The months that followed brought gradual restoration of normalcy to both the company and my relationship with its leadership. Marcus implemented new quality control procedures designed to prevent similar problems in future projects. He expanded the inspection protocols, upgraded material standards, and required additional training for crew supervisors who worked on critical structural elements. The changes were expensive but necessary, representing an investment in long-term reputation that would pay dividends through reduced insurance costs and increased client confidence. More personally, he began consulting with me on major decisions, seeking advice that he no longer assumed he could provide himself. The relationship was professional rather than familial, based on mutual benefit rather than inherited obligation, but it was also respectful and productive in ways that our previous interactions had never achieved. My role evolved from unwanted consultant to valued advisor, with compensation and recognition that reflected my actual contribution to company success. Daniel emerged from the crisis with renewed appreciation for experience and expertise, though our personal relationship remained strained by his earlier abandonment. We worked together effectively on professional matters, but avoided the casual friendship that had once characterized our partnership. The damage was not irreparable, but repair would require time and effort that neither of us seemed willing to invest. Perhaps some betrayals create permanent distance, regardless of subsequent reconciliation or mutual benefit. The important thing was that we could function together professionally, maintaining the collaboration necessary for company success without pretending that personal trust had been restored. Whitmore Construction thrived under the new arrangement, combining Marcus's energy and ambition with my experience and judgment in ways that produced better results than either approach alone could have achieved. The company took on larger projects, expanded into new markets, and built a reputation for quality that attracted premium clients willing to pay for superior workmanship. The success vindicated both my insistence on proper procedures and Marcus's vision for growth, proving that age and youth could complement rather than compete with each other when mutual respect replaced assumed authority. I maintained my own office and independent schedule, consulting on projects that interested me while declining work that seemed routine or uninspiring. The arrangement provided income, purpose, and professional satisfaction without the daily pressures that had defined my previous role in company management. The annual banquet arrived again, though this year's event felt different from its predecessor in fundamental ways. I was seated at the head table, introduced as senior technical advisor, and recognized for my crucial role in navigating the company through its most serious crisis in decades. Marcus presented the year's achievements with confident professionalism, but he also acknowledged the expertise and guidance that had made those achievements possible. His presentation included specific recognition of my contributions, both historical and current, to the company's reputation and success. The applause was genuine and extended, reflecting appreciation that felt authentic rather than perfunctory. The evening proceeded with awards and recognition for various company achievements, but the tone was more collaborative and less autocratic than the previous year's celebration. Marcus had learned to share credit as well as responsibility, understanding that leadership required acknowledgement of others' contributions rather than claims of individual brilliance. He spoke about teamwork, experience, and the importance of learning from those who had faced similar challenges in the past. The change in his approach was remarkable and permanent, representing growth that went beyond simple crisis management to encompass fundamental shifts in his understanding of authority and respect. During the evening's final presentations, Marcus announced that I would be assuming an expanded advisory role in company operations, with particular responsibility for quality control and client relations. The position would involve regular consultation on major projects, oversight of critical construction phases, and mentoring of younger employees who could benefit from decades of accumulated knowledge. The role was substantial and respected, providing influence without daily administrative burdens and recognition without the pressures of ultimate responsibility. It was, in many ways, the ideal arrangement for someone my age with my experience and priorities. I accepted the position with gratitude that was both professional and personal, acknowledging not only the opportunity, but also the journey that had led to this moment of mutual understanding and respect. The speech was brief but heartfelt, focusing on the satisfaction of contributing to work that would outlast all of us, and the privilege of sharing knowledge with those who would carry the company forward into the future. The response was enthusiastic and sustained, suggesting that my colleagues genuinely valued my continued presence and participation in company success. I drive past construction sites now with different eyes, seeing projects as collaborative achievements rather than personal monuments. The work continues with the same commitment to quality and craftsmanship that has always defined my approach to the industry. But it also incorporates new methods and technologies that expand possibilities I could never have imagined alone. Young crews tackle challenges with energy and innovation while respecting principles and practices that have proven their value over decades of application. The combination produces results that satisfy both traditional standards and contemporary expectations, building structures that serve their intended purposes while advancing the state-of-the-art in construction excellence. My house feels less empty now that purpose has returned to my daily routine. The rooms echo with planning sessions and technical discussions rather than silence and regret. Colleagues visit regularly to review plans, discuss problems, and seek guidance on decisions that affect both immediate projects and long-term company strategy. The kitchen table has become an informal conference room where experience meets ambition, where lessons learned from past mistakes inform decisions about future opportunities. The transformation has been gradual but complete, restoring meaning to spaces that had felt like monuments to irrelevance just months earlier. Marcus stops by most Thursday evenings, ostensibly to review project schedules, but actually to continue an education that neither business school nor family connections could provide. He asks questions about managing difficult clients, handling unexpected complications, and maintaining quality standards under pressure from deadlines and budgets. The conversations have evolved from desperate crisis management to thoughtful professional development, creating a mentoring relationship that benefits both his leadership growth and my sense of continued relevance. He listens with attention that was absent during his early assumption of authority, taking notes on insights that he now recognizes as valuable rather than obsolete. The change reflects maturity gained through adversity, wisdom earned through mistakes that could have been avoided with proper guidance. Daniel has begun joining these sessions occasionally, contributing perspectives that bridge my traditional approaches with Marcus's innovative ideas. The three-way discussions are productive but careful, acknowledging the professional necessity of our collaboration while respecting the personal boundaries that crisis has established between us. We focus on technical matters and business strategy, avoiding topics that might resurrect conflicts that are better left buried. The arrangement works because it serves everyone's interests while demanding nothing beyond professional competence and mutual respect. Trust may never be fully restored, but effective cooperation has proven possible without requiring personal reconciliation. The Hawthorne Project has become a teaching tool rather than a source of embarrassment, referenced regularly in discussions about quality control and client relations. Marcus uses it to illustrate the importance of proper supervision and adequate testing, turning his mistake into a lesson that prevents similar problems on subsequent projects. The transformation of failure into education demonstrates the kind of mature leadership that crisis sometimes produces in people wise enough to learn from their errors. Mrs. Hawthorne herself has become an unexpected advocate for the company, impressed by the professionalism of our response to her complaints and the quality of the reconstruction work that corrected the original defects. Spring brought new contracts that challenged every skill the company possessed, complex projects that required the combined expertise of multiple generations to complete successfully. I found myself working longer hours than I had expected in retirement, but the work felt purposeful in ways that pure leisure never could. The satisfaction came not only from solving technical problems, but from watching younger colleagues develop capabilities that would serve them throughout their careers. Teaching had become as rewarding as building, perhaps more so because its effects would multiply through the students who would eventually become teachers themselves. The company's reputation has recovered completely from the crisis that once threatened its survival, but the lessons learned have been incorporated permanently into standard operating procedures. Quality control measures that were once suggestions have become requirements. Client communication protocols that were once informal have become systematic, and consultation with experienced advisors that was once optional has become mandatory for major decisions. The changes represent institutional learning that will protect future projects from the kind of negligence that created the original crisis. My phone rings now with opportunities rather than emergencies, invitations to consult on projects that recognize my expertise as valuable rather than obsolete. Other construction companies seek guidance on technical challenges. Professional associations request presentations about quality management, and industry publications solicit articles about best practices in client relations. The recognition is gratifying, but also useful, establishing income streams that supplement company consulting while building a reputation that extends beyond regional boundaries. Retirement has evolved into a different kind of career, one that emphasizes wisdom over energy and influence over authority. The satisfaction runs deeper than professional recognition or financial security, reaching into questions of purpose and legacy that had seemed permanently resolved by forced retirement. Work provides identity for people like me, meaning that transcends mere employment to encompass fundamental questions about worth and contribution. The restoration of meaningful work has restored confidence in ways that money alone could never achieve, proving that dismissal was premature and that experience retains value even in rapidly changing industries. The vindication is complete, but not vindictive, focused on future contributions rather than past grievances. Evening walks through my neighborhood now include stops at houses I helped build decades ago, structures that have aged gracefully because they were constructed properly from the beginning. The longevity is visible in small details that most people never notice. Foundations that remain level, walls that show no stress cracks, roof lines that maintain their original angles despite years of weather and settling. These monuments to craftsmanship will outlast everyone who built them, anonymous testimony to standards that never go out of style. The knowledge that my hands helped create these permanent improvements to the community provides satisfaction that transcends any temporary recognition or acclaim. Marcus has grown into leadership that combines ambition with wisdom, innovation with respect for proven methods. His decisions reflect careful consideration of long-term consequences rather than short-term advantages, showing maturity that crisis accelerated, but that character made possible. The company's future under his direction appears both promising and sustainable, built on foundations that will support growth without sacrificing the principles that created its original success. My role in his development has been significant but not exclusive, one influence among many that shaped his evolution from arrogant assumption to thoughtful leadership. The annual holiday party approaches again, but this year I anticipate it with satisfaction rather than dread. My contribution to company success has been acknowledged, my expertise has been valued, and my future involvement has been secured through mutual respect rather than family obligation. The reversal is complete and permanent, establishing relationships based on merit rather than sentiment and cooperation rather than dominance. The evening will celebrate achievements that belong to all of us, recognizing individual contributions while honoring collective success. The microphone waits on the podium, ready to carry words of gratitude and recognition to colleagues who have learned to value experience as well as innovation. This time the message will acknowledge contributions from every generation, celebrating both energy and wisdom as essential elements of continued success. The speech will be brief but meaningful, focused on the future rather than the past, and on collaboration rather than competition. Most importantly, it will speak from a position of respect rather than dismissal, influence rather than irrelevance, and purpose rather than regret. The lights dim as the program begins, but the future has never appeared brighter.